Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for attending this very last seminar of the 2022-2023 Gilbrea Annual Seminar Series. This session is hybrid. I have actual humans in front of me as well. So thank you so much to all of those who are joining us via Zoom, as well as those who are joining us at the, I have it here, live viewing session. Sounds like a party, which it is, at McMaster. I would like to begin, though, by giving honor and thanks to the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations as the traditional inhabitants of the lands where McMaster stands. And to say this is to acknowledge those who are here and are here before us, and to recognize our responsibility as guests to respect and honor the intimate relationships that Indigenous peoples have to this land. So this year, our seminar series really explored and focused on the theme of community gerontology. And the seminar series has really created fantastic opportunities for the exchange of ideas and has stimulated discussion amongst researchers, graduate and undergraduate students, community members, and older adults as well. We are so thrilled, and as her supervisor, I'm particularly thrilled and proud to have Amanda Bull here with us in person at McMaster to present her seminar titled, "I Never Thought This Would Happen to Me: Older Adults' Experiences of Ageism in the Ontario Workplace and Labour Market." So for those of you who are joining us, just a bit of etiquette, I suppose, before we get underway here. If you're on Zoom, please keep yourself on mute during the presentation, just to help avoid background noise. Amanda will be sharing with us maybe about 40. Between 30 and 40 minutes. And so we'll have plenty of time afterwards for some hopefully exciting and fulsome questions and conversations. Please feel free to type your questions into the chat box at any time. And Meredith is standing by to take a gander at those chats and questions. And during the question and answer period, you're also welcome to unmute yourself and ask Amanda those questions directly. And I apparently will be moderating the Q&A, which is great. Okay, so to introduce our speaker here at our last seminar of the Gilbrea Annual Seminar Series, Amanda Bull, who's just to my right here, is a second-year MA student in McMaster's Department of Health, Aging and Society. Her SSHRC-funded graduate work aims to build off of the work that she completed as an undergrad student at the U of T. By seeking to gain a more nuanced understanding of the lived experiences of older adults who face ageism in the workplace, the results that she's coming to and will be sharing with us seek to inform equity, diversity, and inclusion policies that often neglect age-related concerns. Amanda is also the first recipient, the inaugural recipient of, and is the recipient, I'll say that awkwardly, but the 2022 Carl Kananen Graduate Student Research Scholarship recipient. So I would invite you all in joining me in welcoming Amanda Bull. Thank you so much, Amanda.
All right, thank you, Nicole, and thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I'm nervous. Thank you. I ask for your grace, you know, ease my nerves, but yeah, I'll just share my screen and then get started. How's that looking? Okay, so like Nicole said, the title of my presentation is going to be "I Never Thought This Would Happen to Me: Older Adults' Experiences of Ageism in the Ontario Workplace and Labour Market." And this work really just constitutes the research I completed for my thesis as part of the McMaster Haas master's program. So this is what I'm going to be talking about today throughout the presentation. I'm going to start with a brief discussion of why ageism in the workplace is important, a little bit of an overview about ageism in the workplace, why I chose to focus on it for my MA, and then I'm going to go over, again, a brief highlight of my methods, my results, finish off with some important reflections, implications, and conclusions that I was able to draw from my results. So for these next couple slides, I'm just going to give you an overview of what ageism is and some important background on the workplace in particular. On this slide here, you can see that I have the first iteration of a definition of ageism. It was first defined by Robert Butler in 1969 as a systemic discrimination against individuals for reasons based solely on their age. Ageism is highly prevalent throughout all aspects of society, and in his first description of this phenomena, Butler compared its severity to that of racism and sexism. And since Butler first introduced scholars to this concept, literature in fields of gerontology, sociology, psychology, communication, etc., have confirmed that ageism is in fact universally occurring. And several important legal landmarks have been introduced in response to this recognition. Typically, age-based discrimination can be characterized into four main categories: personal ageism, which occurs person to person; institutional ageism, which comes in the form of formalized policies and practices; as well as intentional and unintentional ageism, which I think is fairly self-explanatory. I'm sure many of you guys have heard the saying that ageism is the only remaining socially acceptable form of discrimination, and that was really proven true in several surveys of the Canadian landscape, but especially in Revere's 2012 report on ageism. It was a really quantitatively comprehensive study, and it provided a lot of insight into the staggering prevalence of ageism in our society. So they found that 79% of all aged Canadians agreed that older adults over the age of 75 are seen as less important and are ignored more often than younger folks. As well, they highlighted some of the ways in which older Canadians experience ageism in their daily lives. And you can see here that 41% of respondents reported being ignored or treated as though they were invisible. 38% said that they thought people thought they had nothing to contribute. 27% noted that people assumed that they were simply incompetent. And a myriad of others shown on the slide here. Older adults were treated like they were children, thought to have memory or hearing loss, as well as just assumptions that they were slow-witted and overall disrespect. So looking at ageism in the workplace more specifically, I've chosen to highlight this quote here from Dennis and Thomas because I feel like it really does a really good job at articulating why ageism in the workplace is such an important arena in which to investigate ageism. It says that the workplace as a microcosm for society reflects the stereotypes and biases that are part of the national social environment. Often discrimination of any kind that takes place in the work environment can be categorized into four main typologies. So covert hostility, which can be described as passive hostility. It includes the implication of a threat, but not an explicit statement. Verbal hostility, manipulation, as well as physical hostility. The most common ageist behaviors encountered in the workplace, however, are reported as having your work contributions ignored, being left out of decisions that affect one's work, being talked down to by coworkers, and being talked down to by bosses. Instances of ageism in the workplace are negatively related to levels of job satisfaction and job commitment, which makes it even more difficult to retain older employees who are experiencing ageism. And in terms of what we already knew about the experience specifically of ageism in the workplace, is frankly very, very little, and only a couple scholars have attempted to qualitatively study and understand ageism in the workplace over the years. So why ageism in the workplace? Why now? Why for my MA? Comes down to a couple of things. First, it's an incredibly important, relevant, and prevalent issue. As you can see from just a couple recent news and magazine headlines I've pulled, folks are now just sort of coming to this realization that we have a quote unquote graying workforce. The labor market is aging, and in response, people are recognizing the discrimination that comes along with that. It's also particularly timely in the context of the current labor shortages that we're seeing across the globe, as well as in Canada. It doesn't necessarily bode well for us that we have a whole lot of job vacancies, yet the labor market continues to spit out older workers for, frankly, quite absurd reasons. So I think that ageism in the workplace in particular is becoming a really important part of not only a scholarly dialogue, but part of a more national conversation that hopefully my work can contribute to. So moving on to my research now, given the gaps in the literature that I identified, I wanted to ask the main research question of what are older workers aged 55 plus lived experiences of ageism? I also had a couple sub-questions that helped me target further insights that included how do older workers view or understand their experiences of ageism? Do older workers internalize their experiences of ageism? If so, how? And what are the intersections of ageism with other forms of discrimination in the workplace, like sexism, racism, and homophobia? Of course, in order to try and answer those questions, I adopted qualitative research methods, including semi-structured interviews and thematic analysis. I drew upon the social constructionist perspective to frame my thinking. This point of view really highlights the social, historical, collective nature of human consciousness, and it kind of problematizes the idea that there's one strict, true, objective observation of events. And in relation to other research in this field, I really found that this was a unique way in which we could examine the issue. Data collection began with the recruitment of my participants. They were above the age of 55, are currently in the labor market, or recently left voluntarily or involuntarily, and we're trying to re-enter. I chose 55 in order to remain consistent with not only scholarly literature, but also in response to this kind of looming legacy of mandatory retirement at the age of 65. So there's kind of a recognition that what an older adult is in the workplace is a little bit younger than what it is in typical society. I interviewed 10 participants, and I interviewed them over Zoom. You can see here some details of my participants. You can see that they were, the youngest was 55, the oldest was 68. They were mainly female. They were also a particularly Caucasian and highly educated group whose employment spanned a variety of sectors. Once I completed my transcription of the interviews, thematic analysis was used to construct my interpretations of the interview data. The process for which I did that has been outlined by several authors, but I followed Braun and Clarke's 2006 model with 6 steps that included familiarizing myself with the data, generating initial codes, searching for themes, reviewing themes, defining and naming themes, and then finally producing the final report that constituted my, my thesis. So now I'm going to talk about my results, what I found during my interviews. I interpreted 5 core themes in total, which were called the nature of the ageist interaction, psychosocial consequences, preferred coping mechanisms, intersections with other forms of discrimination, and the degree of COVID-19 impact. For the sake of time and for the sake of me not having to talk for an hour and a half, I'm only going to touch on the first 3. So starting with the nature of the interaction. So one of the main aims of this research was to discover how older adults experience ageism. And with that, my interviews really attempted to elicit a rich description regarding what has actually happened in the workplace that would constitute age-based discrimination. The most common form of ageism in the workplace was found to be implicit in nature, and very rarely did participants report incidents that involved explicit discrimination. It was interesting to note that participants were less interested in talking about the experience of ageism itself, and when I would prompt them to discuss the specific interactions that they would have been faced with, many of them met me with kind of vague detail. They wanted to quickly move on, and it was difficult to parse out what had actually happened. And I do attribute that largely to the implicit nature of the acts. That being said, I do categorize these into either explicit or implicit discrimination, as well as assumptions based off of ageist stereotypes. So despite being a less form of ageism experienced in this sample, several participants faced explicit discrimination in both the workplace and the labor market. As illustrated by this first quote here, sometimes this came in the form of outright trying to get the older adults to leave their place of employment. So Craig here says, you know, most of the young guys will use words that I don't understand and stuff like that, trying to make me feel like I'm less useful in my place of work, trying to do things that will make me seem bad at my job. As well, when discussing the differences in the types of discrimination enacted by men versus women, one participant that I highlight here noted that it was typically their male colleagues who came outright with their true feelings regarding older workers. So Katina here says, from the men, it's hard, it's direct, very explicit, even the way they talk amongst themselves, the way they make you feel. You ask them a question, they're going to question you back. You have to be so diplomatic just to survive it. While explicit ageism was not experienced as often as its implicit counterpart, it was equally as distressing and harmful. And participants, in addition to these instances that I talk about here, they reported being directly intimidated in their workplace by their younger colleagues, and they reported being told outright that they would not be placed in the mix for certain opportunities by virtue of their age and the accompanying perceptions and stereotypes. And I think this just really points to the degree to which the ageist attitude and the devaluation of older adults in general have permeated the collective consciousness of the labor market. So now nearly every participant reported some experience of implicit discrimination in their respective workplaces, or even when seeking re-entry into the labor market. And this came in such a wide variety of actions, words, policies, etc. Implicit discrimination was really widely experienced among those participants who were in the search for employment, as I show here with these two quotes. Numerous individuals found that despite their experience and interview skills, they had simply been unable to find work. And most participants described not even being asked for a single interview out of the dozens of applications sent in. So Denise here says, I had a real series of really fabulous jobs. I was well known in the field and I could not get another job. This was 8 years ago. I was about 57. It was impossible. I just could not get a job or even an interview. And the other quote here notes that or says that I've seen ads out there where they only ask for 2 or 3 years of experience. Okay, and I can apply and I don't even give my full years of experience in my field of work anymore because it won't get past the AI. Even though I've been told I shouldn't do that, they can see however many years of experience I have. Participants also talked about about social groups that formed in their workplace and how these operated to systematically exclude older workers in such a way that began to impact their job performance. While certainly not as easily identifiable as explicit discrimination, this form was rather felt than seen. In addition to implicit and explicit acts of discrimination, the participants described at length this third category that they didn't really feel could be placed into the silos of either implicit or explicit. The participants highlighted the assumptions that were made regarding them based on ageist stereotypes. So numerous participants highlighted the fact their coworkers, peers, and employers tended to make really negative assumptions about their abilities in the workplace. And in this first quote here really illustrates how for those participants who were seeking to re-enter the workplace, there are assumptions that you will be unable to perform even the basic of tasks due to non-existent age-related concerns. So Winter here says, every company that I've been in, I always have seen a variety of ages, but it's as soon as you step outside, whether it's a couple years away, they think that you have nothing to offer. It's as if they think I can't do anything because I'm older. Folks also remarked on the intergenerational tension that existed in their workplaces. Their younger peers consistently disregarded their knowledge, creating a really tense us versus them environment. Katina here mentions, and then you get all these younger people around you who have no clue how in-depth your knowledge is, and they're just going on stereotypes, A lot of stereotypical. I find the younger people the most ageist, and I particularly found the group from 20 to 40, 45 the most ageist people I encounter. Horrible, absolutely horrible. And maybe it's because they feel the need to fight for their jobs. Several individuals further discussed the assumptions that were made about their experience, and these tended to be really quite varied, but included stereotypes about the value of their experience, as well as the amount of experience that they have based on their age. And some participants noted how their experience was considerably devalued by their superiors and coworkers because it wasn't seen as the quote unquote right experience, and people were simply unable to understand the importance of their years of experience and the insights, the transferable insights that have been gained over that time. There were so many more that were talked about, like assumptions about personality and career desires, but those two that I touch on were the biggest ones mentioned by my participants. And all of these, no matter what they were about, they drew on negative archetypes of older adults that really contributed to this unfair treatment of older workers in the labor market. So, given all of those quite varied experience that I touched upon in that last slide, it's natural to assume all of these participants subsequently dealt with quite a few psychological and social consequences. And these ranged from mental health diagnoses such as depression and anxiety to more emotional responses like anger, shame, fear, and more. What was most surprising to me was that they faced these existential considerations that were directly onset by their experience of ageism. So first I'll touch on mental health issues. One of the more common self-reported diagnoses within the participant pool was that of depression. And while not every individual received a medical diagnosis from a physician, or they nonetheless described very unique instances of serious depression. So Marion here says, there are times where despite my trying to be positive and professional and realize there's a lot of people who did respect what I did, it did at times, there were moments where you feel a little depressed that you're being passed by younger people and you're not seen as having anything valid to offer. I think that's partly our society, which is a youth worshiping society, which is depressing in and of itself. In addition to these seriously depressive episodes that were experienced by the participants, others identified a debilitating anxiety that they were faced with as a direct result that they attributed to be a direct result of the ageism they experienced. both in the workplace and the labor market. So Winter here says, the last couple of weeks have been really tough. When you talk about anxiety, it's been really tough because you ask what it has done to me personally. It has, I don't want to give into it, but it has aged me more. I am anxious all the time, now even with stuff that isn't work related. So there was also emotional challenges such as fear, shame, etc., that compounded these mental health issues that participants faced. This was only natural that given the hardships each individual incurred in the workplace, that they faced a variety of responses to these experiences. The first participant here is quoted saying, "I'm starting to feel like, screw you. I think there's something wrong if you spent 30 years of your life doing something and then you have to give it up to make less money just to be at peace. There's something ridiculously infuriating about that." She and other participants were clearly quite angry about the financial, emotional, and working situations that were forced upon them. And this was primarily due to their frustration surrounding what appears to them as others' problem with something as trivial as age. This next quote I have up here, I chose because not only was it very emotional and she was in tears as we were speaking about it, but even though it was just about her shame, it manages to touch on these wide-reaching impacts of ageism outside of just emotions. So the individual, she had to spend money to travel out of her way, out of her geographical comfort zone, to work for a minimum wage job that they were way overqualified for. And she says here, "I was so beyond ashamed to work for minimum wage. You have no idea how hard that was. And I picked a place that no one would know me because I was so afraid to be seen. I was forced to take this job. I was so embarrassed, so ashamed." Folks also talked about the stress that they had surrounding the financial instability that had developed since losing work or since the threat of losing work had been imposed upon them. They also were afraid of never being able to work again, and they also struggled with losing such a key piece of their identity in being a person who works. By being forced to deal with these new emotional challenges, the participants they had to take their focus away from important matters that were central to their continued or renewed employment. So participants also were having these more existential crises and thoughts. Existential crises can be characterized by this feeling that life lacks meaning, coupled with a confusion surrounding personal identity. And most of the discussion with participants revolved around the fact that they now believed that they were at the end of what was kind of placed into two categories. And the first was the end of their working lives. And the second kind was much more distressing, but it was one that made them fear that the end of their lives overall was near. As significant individuals in their lives, like colleagues, managers, saw them as old, out of touch, or useless in the workplace, they began to believe that about themselves outside of their working lives. So two representative quotes that I have here up on the slide. The first one from Winter, who says, "And the more they keep telling you this stuff about yourself, I look in the mirror and think, oh my God, is my life over? And then you have the regrets. Sorry, I know this sounds stupid or bizarre or crazy, but I never believed that I personally was going to die. I know this is, but I never really thought about that. And now it's all I think about." And Denise also says, "People I know are starting to die. My husband died at 57 from cancer, and he's not the only one. And so there's a part of it for all of us. There's a sense that life doesn't go on forever. The thing about mortality is it's a balancing act. I'm very aware of it. I've been through that, and I've known a lot of people who've passed away. And so that perspective of being older and knowing that we're not here forever." So I know that I've covered a lot up to this point, but I think that it was important to just understand the sheer quantity of factors that are impacting these older workers. That being said, participants did find ways to help them deal with these experiences and these new mental and emotional health concerns, which I will talk about right now. So like I said, the participants all developed really specific and unique coping mechanisms to manage their experiences and the subsequent challenges that accompanied ageism. And they were really quite varied between participants, but I categorized them into the ways in which they cope. So by themselves, via external relationships, and through actions. One of the most prevalent coping techniques that became clear throughout analysis was the gaining of perspective. By placing these really hurtful and harmful events into perspective, by doing their own research, their own reading, participants were able to efficiently manage their priorities In other words, what happened in the labor market no longer affected them as deeply when they considered the bigger picture. This first quote here explicates, I think, this really well. Denise says, I have perspective. I guess that's what it is. I have perspective that, yeah, I may not be able to go on a vacation every year, but I think that's really important. I'm not in the same position as somebody who's financially struggling, but I feel like I could contribute for a sense of satisfaction in my work. That is what's missing. There are other things that are good. Participants also found that they were able to gain perspective when they were purposefully seeking out both internal and external validation. They would concentrate on positive affirmations that they received from themselves or from others to feel better about themselves and their respective situations. While many participants were able to generate some perspective on the subject, several individuals indicated they were simply able to internalize their experiences of ageism in the workplace. Male participants in particular were far less likely to admit how they dealt with negative experiences and emotions, and they were more often, could be characterized as demonstrating this internalization of their experiences. And these individuals often describe themselves as fighting the emotions, dealing with them on their own, ignoring the feelings, a lot of violent-ish imagery. And this, I think, really just demonstrates the gender roles that men have to be tough. They can't let more of these affective matters influence them. And this is illustrated by Craig here, who says, I try to keep them inside of me and not let anyone know how I'm really feeling inside. It is something that I'm combating inside. I think I'm able to cope with it that way, so I don't bother them with the feelings, and I just keep it all to myself. Others describe their method of internalization as just simply letting things roll off their back because they just, and I quote, don't care anymore. Participants also drew on individuals external to themselves to assist in the negotiation of these negative experiences and emotions. The reliance on friends and community was a major contributor to this sub-theme. And participants talked about being able to open up to their closest friends and how these people can help them come to terms with what they had been going through. While some individuals, they highlighted the importance of their community having a very intimate understanding of what the experience of ageism is like. Others, like the quote I have here, felt that it was important to lean on folks who were totally separate from the situation and could simply empathize as a friend. So Marion here says, I had a whole community of friends that was totally separate from my job, from whom I got validation. I stayed in touch with my volunteers and staff. It helped to talk to people who weren't directly involved in the situation. Other participants also talked about how forming community and social groups that specifically cater to older workers was helpful due to these built-in supports that provided assistance on job search strategies, interview techniques, and just overall a really true understanding of what they were going through and could offer support in that way. In another kind of separate vein, some participants didn't really want to share with their family or friends. They didn't want to burden them with these negative emotions, but they rather drew on a reliable therapist or counselor, like Katina on the slide here, who says, a good CBT counselor, cognitive behavioral therapy, that's really helped me, especially with the depressive thoughts and anger that I had. The advice that these professionals were able to provide and their specific training to offer support for mental health issues was really hugely important for these participants. And participants also reported that they were able to take some specific actions that allowed them to negotiate their negative ageism experience. Physical activity in particular was described as one of the more helpful things that can be done. And this allowed participants to release anger, generate endorphins, find social groups, and also create goals that are external to their professional lives. They could try to attain related to their work. And this was highlighted by several of the participants. But Winter here mentions, I've always been very physically active. And if it wasn't for before COVID, I went to a boxercise class where we were hitting a bag, which boy, that really helped. It made me feel invigorated, young. I felt like who I really was, not what people think I am. There was also this idea of creating both a physical and theoretical space between participants and work. Janice in this quote here highlights the creation of a physical space. So she says, I just leave. My office is upstairs and I just close the door, go downstairs. Usually I go for a walk after work. Now it's up and down a set of stairs. I try and make it more of a final thing. Like this one room is my office and then I close the door, and at the end of the day, that makes it a little bit easier. There's also a theoretical space. So participants would practice sort of escapism so they could be in a different place. And This could be jumping into a television show or reading a really good book, anything that kind of takes them away from their reality. Now, even though I touched on only 3 of the 5 themes, I hope you can all see how just incredibly varied and rich the accounts of ageism in the workplace are. But there were also commonalities and comparable narratives throughout which I was able to kind of latch onto in order to figure out what this all means, where we go from here. That's what my final slides are going to touch on. So what does all of that deluge of information that I just gave you mean? First and foremost, it fills a lot of the knowledge gaps that I identified at the outset of my project. The qualitative approach in a Canadian context allowed me to capture a fulsome picture of the experience of ageism in the workplace. It allowed me to identify the nuances, contradictions, and emotions that quantitative scholarship simply can't really describe. And I also included a wide age range that accompanied kind of a unique geographical profile of Ontario workers. My participants also provided me with a glimpse into a social world that has been largely misunderstood due to the dominance of unreliable and inconsistent quantitative research. Can you tell I'm a qualitative researcher? Participants introduced ideas of knowledge evaluation, being perceived according to age-based stereotypes, social exclusion in the workplace, the concept of having too much experience, as well as what they felt the ideal employee was, with themselves being excluded from the definition every single time. And by understanding the variety of experiences, I was able to pinpoint how truly paradoxical the labor market is and can be. Undoubtedly, employers and organizations want to succeed and retain high quality staff, but we see here that they are systematically eliminating and discouraging older workers from staying in the workplace or re-entering the workplace. And these are the folks who objectively possess the most experience. These results also allow us to consider what factors contribute to participants' constructions of their ageism experiences. And this was highly reflective of their social contexts, and particularly evident when I think about a couple of social locations in particular. So when looking at employment status, I can see how participants who were unemployed and seeking a position appeared to face more concrete barriers due to ageism and discriminatory attitudes, while older workers who already had jobs were clearly treated quite poorly. The unemployed participants were simply not even permitted interviews for positions, and they maintained a very serious inability to re-enter the labor market. And these individuals faced what I would classify as more severe consequences, such as a financial jeopardy. Those participants who currently maintained a job reported experiencing more implicit discrimination that typically came in the form of ageist stereotyping. This is not to say that the psychosocial impacts met by currently employed participants were not severe, but rather in cases of the unemployed participants, they were compounded by consequences that threatened their wellness beyond just the psychological realm. Gender also played a really dynamic and significant role in this conversation. And this was especially clear when looking at the coping mechanisms that I touched on a little earlier. The male participants were far less likely to admit their techniques for coping with negative experiences and emotions. And these individuals often describe themselves as fighting the emotions, dealing with them on their own, ignoring the feelings. Female participants, on the other hand, were much more open. Their responses were quite varied and represented the numerous ways in which they managed negative experiences. And I saw a further illustration of this when I was examining how participants described these ageist and how these ageist interactions made them feel throughout the interview process. The female participants were able to use much richer description in order to paint a very complete picture of the experience. And male participants, on the other hand, were far less likely to comprehensively describe their feelings. As I wrap up here, I just wanted to highlight some of the steps that can be taken moving forward in terms of future research and policy. Interactions, outcomes, coping mechanisms, among others, they were all highly dependent upon the area of work one participates in, as well as each individual's gender, age, race, socioeconomic status, their abilities. And this means in the future, research to include a significantly larger and more diverse, in terms of location, gender, race, etc., a more diverse sample than that which was possible for my project. This would allow for the inclusion of a variety of experiences that are not limited by any method of categorization. By doing so, the results will be far more representative of the lived realities that exist both in Ontario and in Canada more broadly. In the same vein, future research has to understand how these experiences of ageism can change over time. I was only able to capture these folks at one point in their working lives. And the introduction of a more longitudinal investigation of ageism in the workplace and market can provide greater insight into the ways in which age-based discrimination changes over time. We can also identify the fact that my research produced very broad results that were quite far-reaching into numerous aspects of one's reality. And future investigations can try and avoid this by executing a more focused study into a singular aspect of the ageism experience. For example, a project that exclusively looks at coping mechanisms, or a research question that only seeks to understand ageist aspects of the hiring process. In turn, this will generate a more detailed results that are able to inform policy and practice much more pointedly and with much greater authority. In terms of policy, it's been shown that ageism is quite difficult to prove in the legal landscape. And it's particularly difficult given that there is little to no concrete proof that an act of ageism has occurred. Like I mentioned way back earlier, almost all of the experiences of ageism were implicit in nature. So in the future, employees should be afforded more protection under law in this matter, so as not to discourage employees from coming forward and reporting age discrimination. This could include a more broad definition of age-based discrimination in order for that implicit to fall under the legal purview. This was key considering that by and large, age discrimination was categorized as implicit, not only in my research, but in other research like mine. Some scholars have also claimed that the current workplace practices aren't fully in compliance with the Ontario Human Rights Code. And this is even more obvious when you're listening to and analyzing the stories that were provided by my participants. In order to kind of rectify this matter and ensure a total and complete compliance to the corresponding legislation, the Human Rights Tribunal should produce several orders that kind of further dictate the actions of employers more pointedly. It's really essential that organizations are forced to alter their hiring practices in such a way that we specifically seek out older workers who we know bring a rich experience and knowledge to the labor market, in addition to developing new education and training programs for workers that focus on countering ageist stereotypes. So thank you all very, very much. Yeah, that brings me to the end. Questions?
Amanda, thank you so much for guiding us through your important and timely research there. I would like to open up the floor for questions now. You're more than welcome to type in your question in the chat box. And I'll just maybe, if you could wave if there's one coming in, or you're also welcome to just raise a hand and unmute yourself and ask a question as well. Ah, perfect. Michael, yeah, please, thank you. Please unmute your.
Got my sound.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry.
Okay. My name is Mike Keogh. I chair a group called Older Workers of Newfoundland and Labrador. Our group's been on the go since 2018. Amanda, I want to thank you for so cleanly and clearly portraying or bringing out the facts, most of the facts, many of the facts as they relate to ageism, particularly in the workplace. We've been at this now for going on 5 years. We specialize in advocacy and identifying and removing barriers and partnerships with industry and government and things like that. But most of what you have said there, if I were grading it on, on a scale of 1 to 10, you certainly would get a 9. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. I think you've done a magnificent job of being able to put forth what's going on, what's really going on there. One of the things I want to, after complimenting you for that, one of the things we've been so active in this that we come across is that ageism is so difficult amongst workers in the workplace, particularly in getting jobs, is that older workers are reluctant to speak out. Most of them have spent a lifetime giving and leading, whether they're women particularly, raising families, education, working, all the things that go along with that. And yet when they need help themselves, they're reluctant to reach out. So when we go looking for them, identify them to find out how we can help, they're really reluctant to get out because they feel less then. They feel, so all the things, I won't go through what you just did, but you pretty well hit it on the nail all the way through. So I thought for a while I wasn't going to get to this afternoon because I was meeting with our seniors advocate for Newfoundland and Labrador. But I hope at some point in time we get a chance to use your address here today in our work, because it's very well done. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Sorry, we're having some technical difficulties here. Thank you, Michael. If there are any more questions, are there some in the chat?
Oh, Audrey, just one sec as we.
Oh, good. Thanks so much, Amanda. That was a lot to think about and really interesting quotes and sort of talking about a lot of the different threads that run through this. And I was thinking while you were talking about if there's some, like, whether this varies by sector as well as by sort of the type of jobs or the level of jobs that people seek, you know, like, I mean, an extreme example would be in politics, we're really happy to elect older white men in their 80s, right? And so there's no underrepresentation there. But, you know, I'm thinking, I listened to that one quote of the woman who said she was forced to take that job and she felt really ashamed of it. And so I apologize because I tuned in a little bit late, but are there any data that sort of breaks this down by where we're falling short, right? Where is this happening the most, and how can we maybe find ways to do better and better prepare people for like that third stage of their career where maybe it's after the hump, right? Where maybe it's not always climbing uphill into, like, you know, increasing salaries and increasing responsibility.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, and something that's been raised, you know, a couple of times. I think one thing my research was a little bit limited in the fact that I did only have 10 participants because, you know, I only had so much time. This was for my master's thesis, so I didn't have the luxury of ensuring that I could include folks from a variety of sectors. My participants were mostly office, like what you would classify as an office job. So I don't really have the data to break that down. I would say, just from the research I've done, definitely more front customer facing visual positions, especially with women. We see that more often. Yeah, that's definitely, I think you kind of touched on an important point when you say, you know, you talk about older men in politics. That was definitely something that was touched on by some of my participants, the idea that as an older woman, their knowledge was far less valued than older male counterparts. An older male is kind of revered in terms of what they the knowledge that they bring to the table, and the older women didn't experience that, on the other hand. But yeah, I definitely in the future, if I am lucky enough to pursue this at a PhD level, then that is something that I would love to get into more carefully.
Thank you.
Yeah, I could speak. Are there any questions in the room? Maybe I'll ask it. Oh, Steph.
You
One
can
second.
No, we're good. Okay. Yeah, thank you so much for a really fascinating talk. I was going to ask if I know you said there were other themes that you couldn't speak to in this talk, but I was going to ask, how much of a focus did the idea of intergenerational conflict play a role? And was it more so very blatant or in its expression, or like, was it actually tangible? Was it actually experienced, or was it more in the imaginary? Was it something that people thought was experienced, if that makes a lot of sense? It is 3 o'clock and I'm slowly headed downhill, but.
Sorry, can you just say that one more time?
How did you, if intergenerational conflict was a very prominent theme, perhaps in the other bigger, broader ideas that you set out? Because you mentioned it a little bit, but I didn't know if if it played a bigger role than, yeah.
Yeah, I definitely didn't as much as one might think, which was a little bit surprising to me. In particular, it was mentioned in the context of it was pretty much the only concept that the only time I heard it was in the quote that I shared, the idea of having to fight for their jobs. But I think that, you know, it wasn't really necessarily a focus of mine in particular. So I think that if I had kind of targeted that more specifically, that might have been a bigger factor. But I do think that when we're talking about all of these ageist experiences that I mentioned in that first theme, those were almost all by younger colleagues, by their younger coworkers. So yeah.
Great, fantastic.
Chat from Allison. And maybe I'll if you know, Allison's just asking Amanda to comment on if there were any positive things that your participants identified that employers could do to help with older adults and their workplace experiences.
I'm gonna go with no, definitely not. I mean that was primarily because I was trying to get at those negative experiences. You know, there was the idea, not necessarily in the workplace, but they did talk about, like I said, kind of social groups, you know, not necessarily what things their employers could do, but things that, you know, their colleagues could do. So the forming of social groups, being able to lean on one another, that was important. There's a question that came directly to me, or it also came in the chat.
Yes. Sure.
So
I think at the beginning, yeah, thanks, Meredith. I'm getting chats all around. It's fantastic. It's a group effort. So earlier in Amanda's talk, in her introductory remarks, she stated that ageism is one of the kind of remaining socially acceptable forms of discrimination, and just wondering if you could comment on why that might be. It's a big question.
It's quite a big question. I'll try my hardest. I think if I'm just going off my gut instinct, I would say that it's primarily because of the kind of culture in which we reside. Especially if you think about the media, we think about, you know, anti-aging, everything that we're kind of told, all the messages that we receive are, you know, do not get old, do not look old. So that's why I would say it's one of the most culturally acceptable forms of discrimination. Also, it's very institutionalized. There are a lot of people see that are directly age-gated for, you know, kind of unnecessary reasons. Yeah.
I see we have a question from Cheryl. So Cheryl, just 2 seconds as we do-si-do here with our technical bits and bobs.
Yeah, my question is, it relates similar to something, say, with disability or accessibility. Sometimes people have been in leadership positions or positions of influence, and then they had people report to them who had disability, and then later they require more accessibility and they feel guilt that they had not supported people all those years, or they had been discriminatory against that group that now they are a part of. So there's conflicting feelings of guilt. And I'm wondering if any expressed issues of they regretted any ageist behaviors or attitudes they had, and now we're feeling guilty being part of that group and experiencing it.
A lot of them kind of talked about the idea, like I said, that we reside in this kind of youth worshiping society. So they highlighted the fact that, you know, they admitted the fact that they kind of lived in this world, you know, they participated in that kind of discourse of youth worship. But there wasn't really a conversation. I mean, yeah, that was pretty much the extent of the conversation. Not a lot of the folks I interviewed were in like high managerial positions, so they didn't really talk about, you know, workplace policies in that sense. But yeah.
We have a question coming in from the audience here. Dylan, I'm not sure if you can just really, you know, belt out your question.
Or you can say it and then you could maybe repeat it. So Belinda's question was, she was wondering if I experienced, or if I found that any of my participants kind of portrayed this kind of internalized ageism onto themselves. Definitely, I think that was one that was huge. I would say, I mean, my participant pool was like 70% women. So particularly from the women, there was this idea of ageism onto themselves, but also ageism onto other older women. You know, there was one participant kind of remarked, she said, you know, I'm lucky, I've aged well, I look good for my age. So there was this idea of the visual aspects of aging that was really prevalent with the women. You know, even though we were having this conversation about how harmful ageism is and how negatively it influenced their lives, they were still doing it to their peers.
So thanks, Yvonne, for your question. So Yvonne's asking, in the explicit, implicit descriptions, whether any of Amanda's participants commented on specific body language reactions or instances where they felt excluded by their younger coworkers. Thanks, Yvonne.
I would definitely, body language is, I wouldn't say they remarked upon body language of their colleagues. I would say they talked about physical aspects of the workplace in terms of social groups. They kind of painted this picture of, you know, being in a lunchroom and sitting at a table. There's a bunch of young folks sitting at a table together, and they were off on their own. You know, definitely, I think body language came into play a little bit when they talked about having, you know, a back turned on them. But they didn't go into a ton of detail about body language.
And I think there was a question from Allison, I think I saw there, just some next steps for your work. Or are you done? Yeah.
I'm not done, Allison. Well, I hope I'm not done. I do plan on pursuing my PhD in social gerontology, but fingers crossed, still waiting to hear back about that. And yeah, I will definitely be building upon this work in that, if I am lucky enough to be afforded the opportunity.
Well, we're just about at time here. I want to thank, well, first I would like to invite everyone who's present in person and virtually to join me in thanking Amanda so much for leading us through a fantastic seminar. Well done. Claps, I see. Just as a reminder, this is the very last Gilbrea Center seminar for the 2022 to 2023 year. And we will be starting the seminar series back up in fall 2023. This will be recorded and placed on the Gilbrea Center YouTube channel for posterity, so you can revisit this and watch it again. And thank you again, everyone, so much for joining us in person and virtually, and hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you all so much.